Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a truly wild moment in recent history, the May 2026 summit between the United States and China. When Air Force One touched down in Beijing, it wasn't just your standard state visit. It was a defining moment for a global order that was literally teetering right on the edge between managed rivalry and total rupture.
Let's just jump right in. The whole world was basically holding its breath for this one, and for good reason. This summit was a super rare, incredibly high-stakes collision of immense personal power. Former Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell actually had a great insight on this, noting that both men were virtually unencumbered by bureaucratic constraints. Think about that. We're talking about two leaders who had consolidated authority to a degree we rarely see in modern history, commanding nuclear arsenals and economies making up nearly half the global GDP. They sat down at that table without the usual red tape holding them back, meaning their personal chemistry and their split-second decisions were going to be unusually consequential.
Section 1. A World on Edge. Now, to really grasp the insane pressure these guys were operating under, just think about the sheer weight of one single number, $108. That was the price of a barrel of Brent crude oil right at the time of the summit. Why so high? Well, it was being driven up by this expanding, totally unpredictable U.S. military confrontation with Iran. And this wasn't just some distant international crisis, right? It was creating incredibly toxic economic pressures back home, hitting everyday folks with soaring gas prices. And Beijing, they were dealing with their own massive headaches, a crumbling property sector, high youth unemployment, and the terrifying idea that their Middle Eastern energy supplies might just get cut off entirely.
And the road to get here was a real roller coaster. We started out with decades of hopeful economic engagement after Nixon's opening way back in 1972. Fast forward to Trump's first term in 2018, and suddenly it's an adversarial zero-sum trade war. Then, by early 2025, in his second term, tensions absolutely skyrocketed with those Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs pushing everything to the brink. So by the time we actually get to this May 2026 summit, the dynamic had fundamentally changed. It was highly adversarial and deeply tangled up in a world of multiplying crises.
Section 2. The Diplomatic Theater. Now, for the summit itself, both sides went all in on the pageantry to project control over all that background chaos. Every single detail was a meticulously staged performance of power. The Chinese government rolled out a welcome with incredible precision. I mean, we're talking a crimson carpet that seemed to stretch forever, a 21-gun salute right at Tiananmen Square, and a Golden Room state banquet featuring Beijing roast duck. But what behavioral analysts really fixated on was the diplomatic choreography. As Trump and Xi walked side by side, they'd take a half step forward, then yield to the other. It was fascinating. Neither man was trying to establish physical dominance. Instead, they were projecting this image of absolute mutual control.
But it wasn't just about the visuals. The words they chose were just as calculated. Xi Jinping strategically framed the relationship around its impact on the entire 8 billion global population. By doing that, he was basically asserting complete equivalence with American power. He wasn't just positioning himself as a national leader, but as a central, indispensable global statesman managing the world's most critical relationship.
Contrast that with Donald Trump's approach, which leaned heavily into personal flattery and chemistry. He had explicitly asked for the biggest display in Chinese history, and he got exactly what he wanted, calling it a magnificent welcome like none other. His rhetoric really doubled down on his signature belief that personal relationships can override big structural problems, which ultimately led to him making a dramatic, on-the-spot invitation for Xi to visit the White House later that year.
Section 3. The Economic Elation.
Let's peel back the curtain on the actual economics here, because this is where things get really interesting. We got this classic whip pan effect where massive headlines collide with market realities. Trump announced these huge flashy deals, ag purchases, energy buys, and a massive order for 200 Boeing jets. Sounds amazing, right? But then the details totally dissolved. Boeing released absolutely no confirmation, no pricing, no timeline. The Chinese Foreign Ministry wouldn't confirm it either. And the financial markets, which had actually been pricing in a 500-plane order, immediately punished the illusion. Boeing shares dropped almost 3%. It's a perfect example of how quickly political theater can shatter when it hits the real world.
And you saw the exact same phantom deal play out in tech. Trump announced Washington was clearing the export of highly advanced NVIDIA H200 AI chips to China. But Beijing, they just silently stalled. They held back approvals and heavily favored their own domestic alternatives instead, like Huawei's chip cluster. It got to the point where NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, literally had to stay behind in Beijing to keep negotiating. The fallout? NVIDIA shares dropped nearly 4%, and the broader semiconductor index tanked. The market's verdict was brutally clear. The actual economic deliverables were incredibly thin.
Section 4. Flashpoints and Future Tech.
Because once those closed doors actually shut, they hit some serious, unbridgeable red lines. And absolutely nothing carries more explosive potential than Taiwan. Xi Jinping drew a hard line, calling it a highly dangerous situation. But Trump sent absolute shockwaves through international allies by suggesting that decades-old American arms sales to Taiwan might suddenly be up for negotiation. He essentially broke from the traditional 6 assurances, floating Taiwan as a potential bargaining chip. And while no immediate policy actually changed, it completely terrified allies about American reliability, shaking up the security calculus for the whole region.
The Middle East was another massive wedge. With the Iran war raging, they could really only agree on one basic necessity: keeping the Strait of Hormuz open so the oil keeps flowing. But their overarching strategies? Total opposites. Washington was all about maximum pressure and forcing Iranian capitulation. Beijing wanted a diplomatic solution and was openly criticizing U.S. sanctions. They both wanted to avoid escalation, for sure, but their roadmaps to get there couldn't have been more different.
And meanwhile, that relentless AI and semiconductor arms race, it just kept right on going. Sure, there were some tentative talks about setting up recurring dialogues on AI safety and guardrails, but the fundamental deadlock over advanced tech didn't budge. American officials were getting seriously anxious as Chinese labs kept proving they could match sophisticated US AI models and do it at a fraction of the cost previously assumed. It became obvious that innovation and national security were so deeply intertwined that diplomacy just couldn't keep pace to regulate them.
Section 5. The New Managed Rivalry.
So, when the cameras packed up and went home, what was actually achieved? It's fascinating to watch how both governments immediately spun up parallel realities so they could claim a win back home. The US narrative was all about fantastic trade deals and practical cooperation. Meanwhile, China completely elevated the ideological angle, declaring the establishment of strategic stability and hyping up Xi's prestige as a gracious global host. Two completely different narratives existing side by side with zero reconciliation. Because the reality is, there wasn't some historic breakthrough, no massive trade agreement, no fix for Taiwan, no end to the tech war. What they actually achieved was a mutual commitment to managed rivalry. They both recognized that they're way too interdependent to just divorce, but way too competitive to actually cooperate. The big win wasn't resolving their structural conflicts, it was simply figuring out how to contain them so they don't accidentally spiral into a hot war.
So, I'll leave you with a provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. Did this incredibly choreographed performance actually secure our future by building a real framework for stability? Or did it just delay an inevitable clash? The underlying forces, the tech rivalry, the military buildup, the ideological divide, they are all still operating with a momentum that one single summit just can't stop. We're going to have to wait and see what choices get made now that the cameras are gone. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.